Welcome to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, your guide to future tech trends and innovation in a language you understand. Now, over to your host, Neil Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Now, as many of you know, as well as Spotify, Apple Music, and all the other places you can listen to this podcast, you can also find episodes on YouTube. And although it's audio only, a few listeners said to me some time ago that they just like to listen at work with their browser minimised, so you can find me there too. And I am learning that engagement is a little bit more sarcastic on YouTube. And today I wanted to give it a shout out to John in New York, who said after listening to the kinetics episode, "Neil, how do I remove kinetics? I seem to have picked it up. I don't want it, and I don't know how to get rid of it." I'm assuming it's a joke because I've checked the kinetics website and there isn't a download or any way of getting it on your PC. So I don't know if you were suggesting that kinetics was a kind of a disease. Maybe it was lost in translation. If I've got the wrong end of the stick, please email me at techblogwriter@outlook.com and I'm sure we can sort you out. Anyway, on with today's show. And today I want to speak with Adam Colton, the lead business strategist for QRL, which is Quantum Resistant Ledger. And he's got a passion for emergent and forward-looking technology. And Adam sees blockchain as the foundational technology that will underpin the digital industrial revolution. And he also sees cryptocurrency as not only the financial instrument that can power this new revolution, but also as one of the most dynamic tools for individual financial empowerment that we've ever seen. So I want to dig into his technical expertise and find a little more about the economic impact of quantum computing on the crypto market, along with quantum computing and the blockchain cryptocurrency community. There's some pretty heavy topics to discuss, so grab a nice glass of malt this Thanksgiving, sit in your favourite chair as I beam your ears all the way to Chicago so we can speak with Adam Colton, the lead business strategist for QRL, the Quantum Resistant Ledger. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. My name is Adam Colton, and I'm the lead business strategist for the Quantum Resistant Ledger. What that means is that I basically handle two main duties at QRL. Internally, helping to formulate business strategy, as my title would imply, how we plan to situate ourselves in the broader offering of blockchain products, as well as, externally, which is much more of a messaging, communications-oriented role, where I, sit down for interviews like this and go to conferences and get up on stage and explain things with PowerPoints and create a blog and other types of content that can help sort of explain and to a certain extent evangelize for both the technology as a whole and then sort of our own application of it.
Fantastic. Now, quantum resistant, or the QR ledger, is a vault of blockchain transactions. And my understanding is that it's designed with that long-term stability and security in mind for accounts and transactions. But for anyone listening to us now and are hearing about you guys for the first time, you must get asked this a lot, but what is QRL in simple terms and what kind of problems are you solving?
So in the simplest terms, a lot of times I like to use metaphors. I find it to be a very effective way to explain ideas in a compact way. And I like to talk about it like you're building a house or any type of building, really. You can build higher, you can build wider, you can have the confidence to spend more money and build a nicer building if you have a rock solid foundation. And to our understanding of how this technology works, security is that foundational element. If you don't have security, then 1,000 transactions a second, the value of that is dubious in our opinion. If you can't trust the transactions, does it matter how many you can fit into a single second? If you can't trust that a protocol is still going to be safe 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line, is a big developer going to spend a lot of resources to develop the next amazing application if they think they might have to do it all over again in a few years? And so at its most simple, our hypothesis was, what if we built the most secure blockchain and the most forward-looking type of security in that blockchain, and then stacked things on top of that? Because once you have that rock-solid foundation, you can build as high as you want.
And one of the reasons I was excited to get you on the show today is you come across as someone with a passion for emergent and forward-looking technology and see blockchain as a foundational technology that will underpin the digital industrial revolution. And I also read that you believe that cryptocurrency is not only the financial instrument that can power this new revolution, but as one of the most dynamic tools for individual financial empowerment in decades. So can you tell me a little bit more about your backstory and also what shaped these beliefs?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start with my backstory. My educational background is in the social sciences. My degrees are in anthropology, and then I also have a bachelor's in American studies, which is sort of like not a thing that exists outside of America, but it's basically a hybridized major of like American history, culture, literature, things like that. And so my sort of point of view is very kind of like historical in the way I sort of look at technology, and why I'm actually so fond of and passionate about the future is because of my sort of like attachment to the past in that way. And blockchain, in many ways, is the sort of like ultimate, or you could say like terminal manifestation of the idea of a receipt. In the Western world, there are many different traditions for this, but in the Western world, we can look back to things like the 15th century Venetian Traders Guild. Their sort of pioneering of like a double booking system where it's basically what we understand as a receipt today. The idea that the merchant and the customer both keep a copy of the transaction for greater reliability and sort of safety on both people's sides because they both have a record of what happened. That introduces a new layer of trust in mercantile transactions that is able to sort of supercharge the mercantile ability of kind of like that Venetian Traders Guild and then Europe as a whole. And blockchain is kind of just an extreme version of that. It's instead of two copies of information, it's a potentially near infinite numbers, well, as many nodes as want to hold the information can. And as opposed to it being immutable simply because it's written down in two separate places, it's immutable because it's cryptographically secured and again mirrored on all these different nodes. And all that does is take the trust that was injected by the very first receipt in the Western world and, again, just massively amplifies that. It's kind of like the transition from, the first spark of gunpowder to our modern bombs. It's the same basic idea, combustion in that case, but it's simply been magnified over the decades and really centuries massively. And so in its modern manifestation, becomes almost revolutionary, even though its basic functionality is something that's been around for hundreds of years.
So how did you get involved with QRL? How did you end up there?
So like many people, I had heard of blockchain and cryptocurrency before, the big kind of 2016, 2017 explosion, but it had not always been in positive terms. I remember one of the first things I heard about cryptocurrency was around the Silk Road FBI court case and talking about how it was involved, cryptocurrency that is, was involved the distribution of illegal drugs and all these sort of negative things, but then in 2015 later in the year a friend of mine started really talking to me a lot about it. In 2016, I ended up going through a bit of a career change myself and had some free time on my hands and started educating myself. And then in the early part of 2017 is when I kind of like bought in quite literally and started, trying to figure it out in a more hands-on way. And then in later 2017, I ended up applying my old skill set, sort of a marketing, business strategy, that kind of thing, to this new technology that I was really interested in at QRL. I was a community member in their Slack, because that was sort of the summer of Slack in 2017, and developed a rapport with some of the developers and founders. They ended up having a vacancy where they needed somebody initially just to handle marketing and then to handle a bit more than that as time went on, and I sort of threw my hat in the ring, and the rest is history.
Now, it has been a bit of a rough and rocky road for Bitcoin and the world of cryptocurrencies this week, but rather than talk about that, I wonder if you could share with the listeners your opinion on quantum computing and that threat that it's going to bring to Bitcoin and blockchain technology, and also how blockchain-powered currencies are also under a constant security threat from hackers and other agents out there.
Yeah, so the idea of a double-sided coin or a double-sided sword or whatever, something that gives and takes, is a very useful concept in blockchain because it applies in many different ways. And one of the main ways in this particular instance is the decentralized nature of this technology. So we all love the decentralized nature of blockchain technology because it enables the end user, the person who's actually holding their private key, massively. It gives them massive independence. It gives them massive amounts of control. Unfortunately, it also leaves them kind of on an island security-wise. As much as big banks charge high fees and exert a lot of control and can manipulate people's accounts without their, knowledge or consent, they also act as a mediator, and that gives and takes in its own way. But in blockchain, if somebody accesses your private key and takes your funds, there's very little recourse because there's no way to reverse that transaction, which is also one of the best things about blockchain. But from a network-wide security standpoint, upgrading security infrastructure in blockchain is incredibly complicated compared to upgrading security infrastructure in a centralized system. If a Google wants to upgrade their Gmail security infrastructure, I, as a Gmail user, am not required in that process. They don't need my knowledge. They don't need my participation. They do not need my consent. If Bitcoin, just to use the most well-known example, though this also applies to like pretty much any other cryptocurrency, wanted to change its signature scheme, it would need the private keys of every single wallet on the network. Well, nobody knows the private keys of every single wallet on the network, and that's one of the things we love about Bitcoin. But in this particular instance, it means that every single user needs to be actively aware and actively consent and actively participate in this migration, which would require quite literally millions of people and tens of millions of wallets to all engage in sort of the same process in a relatively finite period of time for like security purposes. And while, I don't think anybody could spend much time in cryptocurrency and start calling things impossible, because this industry has shown the impossible to be possible multiple times. I do have to say that sounds quite difficult, and I'm glad that I'm not working at a blockchain that has to deal with that issue. One of the nice things of being sort of a second or third, depending on how you count it, generation blockchain is we get to, look at both the successes and some of the stumbles that have come before us and get to try to, avoid that and then take that into our own account before we start.
So as cryptocurrencies continue to rise in prevalence, security obviously is of the utmost importance now. But can you also expand on why quantum computing poses a multitude of threats to these traditional blockchain networks?
So the basis for quantum computing's attack vector into blockchain technology is the signature scheme. A signature scheme is your private key and your public key. It's oftentimes referred to as PKI, or public-private key infrastructure. And what it means is that, you have one key that you show the world, and that's sort of in blockchain context also your address. And then you have another key that you don't show anybody. And you use that to sign and to verify that you are who you say you are. And it's a one-to-one relationship. Now, this is all secured by elliptic curve cryptography. In the specific context of blockchain, it's a type of elliptic curve cryptography. It's colloquially referred to as ECDSA, or Elliptic Curve Distributed Signature Algorithm. To make a long story very short, it's basically a curve on a graph like you might see in algebra class. And every XY coordinate on that graph is a public-private key pair, and the way you find it is through some very complicated math. Public-private key infrastructure has been the basis for most digital network technology security since the late 1970s, early 1980s. So it's not super old, but it's not like very recent technology either. And traditional computers cannot crack this, period. Technically, if you gave everybody in the world a supercomputer and they all ran trying to crack the same elliptic curve cryptography signature for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe you'd be able to do it. But functionally, it's impossible until quantum computing comes along. And what quantum computing is able to do is run a piece of math called Shor's algorithm, which was developed by a mathematician named Peter Shor in the 1990s. And what it is a piece of math that factorizes very large numbers effectively, which traditional computers cannot do. And so when you have a sufficiently powerful quantum computer, and that hasn't yet been developed, they're on their way, but they've not yet gotten there, running Shor's algorithm, you'd be able to take somebody's public key and derive the private key that is associated with it through ECDSA, which would allow you to do things like take Bitcoins out of the Satoshi wallets or raid any Ethereum wallet with an exposed public key. And so it's something that needs to be addressed. And because of the sort of quirks and picadillos of blockchain and decentralized technology, we need to address it earlier than centralized systems, which have a God administrator that can just migrate all accounts unilaterally.
Now, I appreciate this is probably a pretty big question, but I mean, what is the answer to keep the necessary evolution of these signature schemes and keep blockchain technology safe and open at the same time?
So that's the good sign of things. That's the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. Having to say goodbye to elliptic curve cryptography, which has been keeping our digital systems secure for the past 3 to 4 decades. I mean, let's be blunt, that sucks. That is a real big bummer. But there's a multitude of solutions. So we personally use hash-based cryptography. We've consistently found in, sort of our experimentations and our, research, I guess is the best way to say it. We thought that hash-based cryptography would make the most sense. But we recognize, and we found during our own process, and I'm sure anybody else can find very easily, there's multiple ways to sort of attack this problem, quite literally, I suppose. So in addition to hash-based cryptography, there's lattice-based cryptography, which I know some other projects that have attempted but not yet implemented quantum resistance in the blockchain space have been experimenting with. There's multivariate cryptography, which I'm personally not familiar with existing in the blockchain space. Code-based cryptography, which I've also not heard of being implemented in the blockchain space yet. And this one's kind of a mouthful. It's called super singular elliptic curve isogenic cryptography. And that one's also, to my knowledge, I think being explored or possibly developed in this space. A lot of projects, not a lot, some of the projects have leaned towards what we've also chosen with hash-based cryptography. And this is where we're running right up against sort of the limits of my technical knowledge. To my understanding, it's because while it can be computationally rigorous, it is reasonably straightforward despite that. So it makes sense, if you're trying to develop a signature scheme. And a lot of this also has to do with things like within a secure system, how, security is always a spectrum. And you can always be like, well, we need things to be more secure or less secure. It's not a light switch. So when you're building a security protocol into your system, you need to be thinking about things like how much, speed and flexibility am I willing to sacrifice for this security? Or alternatively, how much security am I willing to sacrifice for sort of speed and flexibility? And so I would imagine, personally, within the next 10 years or so, most, if not all, of those types of cryptography I just went over will be implemented in blockchain. I don't think this is a system, or a situation rather, where we're going to go entirely from elliptic curve cryptography and everybody's going to switch to hashes or everybody's going to switch to lattice. I think it's going to be multiple solutions to this one problem.
So what is it that excites you about the QRL project? And also for anyone that's new to the project, what is the role of the QRL token in all this?
Right. So like, in Ethereum or anything else, the QRL coin, token, whatever you want to call it, it powers our blockchain. So it's what miners receive as an incentive to run mining nodes, and it's what you use to store value or to access any of the features. Right now, we have a token feature, sort of like an ERC20 type situation. Yeah. We have a notarization feature, which allows you to sort of digitally stamp a document and then put that stamp in the blockchain and then refer to that later as sort of proof that that document looked a certain way at a certain time. One of the things that's going to make both of those features much more dynamic is, but that is not launched yet, let me be clear, is smart contracts, which we're currently exploring and working on. Obviously, smart contract takes a blockchain and puts it more in sort of the protocol category, and that's definitely where we're headed. We foresee a situation where, sort of similar to an Ethereum, if you want to build a dApp, you would consider using QRL because, as sort of I said at the top, we think, and we're sort of betting that we are going to be secure 3, 5, 10 years down the line. So if somebody's sitting here going, all right, I want to build this great dApp, but it's going to take me a year, and then I'm going to need to support it, and I'm going to need to put a bunch of money into the development time. Am I going to want to have to tear everything down, pack it up, and move it over to a different protocol 5 years from now? Probably not. So that's kind of our gamble. We're betting that is going to be something that is desirable in the space: reliability, security, and a robust feature set. Additionally, we're also, in addition to smart contracts, we're also looking into adding a messaging layer, which would allow people to communicate with one another digitally. And their communications would not be stored on the blockchain, but the blockchain would be used to verify the identities of the two communicators at the beginning of the communication session. So sort of like a old school phone call, there would be a record of this address and this address are sending data, but not what was sent, because that would clog up the blockchain in a very short order. But yeah, so that sort of feature set we hope is attractive, and it's all powered by the quantum resistant ledger token.
So where's QRL at the moment in terms of a working product, and how's QRL going to evolve and progress on your roadmap in 2019? Just for anyone listening that want to know where you're heading.
Yeah, so I think it's always useful to tell people, if you're going to talk about where you're heading, where you've been. Yeah. So just briefly give you the life cycle. 2016 in November, the white paper is written and published. In 2017, the money is raised to fund the project and development. The team is mostly hired in the summer and fall of 2017. That's when I was hired. So in 2018, we launched our blockchain. That's this year in June. So we've been operating for about 5 months. And yeah, we've been a fully functional blockchain since June. I actually don't remember the date. I think it's like the 20th, 22nd, something like that. Yeah. And since then, since we launched, we have added in token functionality. We've added in the notarization feature. So that's where we are right now. And then projecting forward, smart contracts we're pursuing, like I said, the ephemeral messaging layer we're pursuing. Those two things, I'm oftentimes asked, well, which one's going to come first? And they're both being pursued sort of separately and equally. So it's a lot more like up to them, I guess you could say, like depending on, the kinks and the trials and tribulations and testing, and then more testing, and then auditing and testing some more. They might finish at the same time or 6 months from one another, but they're both sort of 1 and 1A in terms of the features we're trying to add in 2019. And obviously we'd like to add them sooner than later. Another thing that we've sort of been doing since we launched the actual blockchain is the QRL improvement protocol, or QIP system, where on our GitHub there are proposed improvements to the blockchain, and we open them up to public debate, and we take that debate into heavy consideration when deciding whether or not to add that feature in, or how to add the feature in, or what the feature should ultimately look like. We believe in decentralization, and trying to reasonably incorporate decentralization into whatever aspects of the project we can.
So can you just remind anyone listening where they can find you guys online, get their hands on white papers, roadmaps, or even just contact a member of your team if they've got any questions? What's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, so if you go to theqrl.org, that's our website, and it is the hub from which you can find everything. You can find our social media, whether that be Twitter, Discord, Reddit. You can find links to our foundation, to the documentation if you want to build on our network, to the Explorer if you want to, the Block Explorer if you want to see sort of stats, figures, and watch our network in real time. You can download our wallet client or access our web wallet, and that's where you would find sort of the team section to contact us if you wanted.
Well, a huge thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate it. I know you've had an incredibly busy day and you've got a long drive for Thanksgiving. So a big thank you for taking the time to come on and sharing your story and the story behind QRL. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
As Keanu Reeves would say, whoa. Quantum computing is a heavy topic, but incredibly interesting and fascinating and intriguing all the same. So while all technology will need to deal with quantum computing, there are a set of unique challenges facing blockchain technology. And I loved how Adam explored the central question of what makes a blockchain quantum resistant. I'm also glad he covered areas we seldom hear about, such as one-time signatures, extended Merkle signature schemes, as well as other emerging best practices in the journey towards quantum resistance. And I would be the first to admit to say that I'm not an expert in quantum computing, but what I can tell you is I did learn a lot from Adam today, and I thank him for that. But I want to know what your thoughts are, what your insights are, whether you are inside the quantum computing industry or not. Share your thoughts and your insights by emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, tweet me at Neil C. Hughes, or pop by my website, techblogwriter.co.uk. And for my US listeners, a big happy Thanksgiving from me. And for everyone else out there, be careful on Black Friday. Don't spend too much buying stuff that you just don't need. and avoid those pesky scams. But I'll be back tomorrow, so thanks for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Until next time, remember, technology is best when it brings people together.